It's probably an understatement to say that Disney's live-action remake of The Little Mermaid has received a lot of attention over the last couple years. But despite some inciting media coverage and online discourse, I've actually really been looking forward to seeing this movie, not just out of curiosity, but because the original Little Mermaid was such a formative part of my childhood. With that in mind, there are some coming to this new movie with a lot of emotions and passionate opinions, and I get that.
Some of these opinions at times are, assertive,
declaring that the original Disney version is the definitive, which, after reading and watching more versions of The Little Mermaid than I care to admit for this episode, just doesn't make sense to me. The original story has been retold and reinvented countless times over nearly 200 years, and one of the things that has emerged through its long history, between the lines, as it were, is the story's inherent queerness, unspoken and unrequited love, the Little Mermaid's feelings of isolation, of being misunderstood, and of course, there is the physical transformation of the character. To speak on this particular aspect, I thought it best to invite a friend and colleague to the channel, someone who could offer their own personal view on the subject.
Hi, my name is Hadley Abrams. My pronouns are they, them, and I am an actor and singer in Toronto. I am old enough that all of our Disney movies were on VHS, and we didn't have the OG Little Mermaid. We had the second one, the sequel, which is sort of the inverse of the OG one, because it's her daughter and she wants to be a mermaid and sort of does the same thing, but like in order to live not on land. And that was the one that I connected with more. I was very obsessed with mermaids and like living underwater as a kid. But the OG one like is such a classic and sort of one of the first like inspirations of, ooh, for some reason the idea of, yeah, like living underwater, living in this, like being like having a tail, being like part human, part something else. Like when I figured out the symbolism of that much later in my life, I was like, oh, that was interesting. That was interesting.
The basis of the original Little Mermaid story is quite simply fascinating. And when considering the emotional inspiration of the story, the fact that it's become a classic Disney property is more unbelievable than you think. If you're new to this channel, hi, hello, I do deep dives on the history of musical theater, and in this episode, we're going to be getting into a lot. What inspired the original author to write The Little Mermaid, the animated movie that changed the course of Disney forever, and why nostalgia is a double-edged sword for the live-action remake. Sorry in advance to only briefly touching on the Broadway version. For those looking for a deep dive on that, check out Behind the Magic and their excellent episode in talking about the musical. And before we get started, don't forget to like this video, and if you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other episodes.
Enough of Harlem Nights. Our next film is a real delight, something quite special. More proof that the animated feature film is alive and well again now as the 80s come to a close. The movie is Disney Studios' The Little Mermaid, the beautifully drawn story of a mermaid named Ariel who wants to become human and marry the prince of her dreams.
It's hard to imagine now, but when The Little Mermaid premiered in November of 1989, Disney had only recently been talking about getting rid of the animation department altogether. The studio's output during the 1980s had seen some rough patches of hits and major misses, and a behind-the-scenes power struggle between studio executives, along with their culture clash with artists in the animation department, made many believe that this beloved Disney tradition would soon be a thing of the past. The Little Mermaid began to change this way of thinking, and after 3 Oscars and over $200 million at the box office, Walt Disney Pictures threw newfound energy and financial backing into the future of their animated features like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King, eventually leading to what has come to be known as the Disney Renaissance. The success of The Little Mermaid doesn't just land on one aspect. There's the script and direction by John Musker and Ron Clements, the film's stunning animation and artwork, the absolutely iconic vocal performances by Broadway performers like Jodie Benson, Pat Carroll, and Samuel E. Wright, and then there's Alan Menken's music and Howard Ashman's lyrics. It all just works together. But then, of course, there is the original story by Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen, a story that even before Disney had been through a number of adaptations and interpretations, taking riffs off of Andersen's version, usually making adjustments to suit the times and even its respective audiences. At times, this pivots away from the author's original emotional inspiration. The story was first published in 1837, but even Andersen's telling wasn't the first of its kind. He openly acknowledged taking inspiration from the German novella Undine by Frédéric de la Motte Fouquet, who himself had been inspired by the French folktale of Mélusine. One can also cite the siren, her, from Greek mythology as a source of inspiration. Even elements from operas and ballets like Rusalka and Swan Lake, which are derived from other European folk stories, bear striking similarities to The Little Mermaid. Simply, it's a story that has been around in one form or another for a very long time. What distinguishes Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid are the story elements that seem drawn from his own life. To understand this, we gotta go way back to early 19th century Denmark. Super sexy, I know. Hans Christian Andersen had been born into near poverty in the city of Odense, given a basic education, and from the beginning set his eyes on a world that was beyond his own. He fled Odense for Copenhagen at just 14 years old, with dreams of performing on the stage. He was said to have a remarkably strong and beautiful soprano singing voice, but shortly after arriving in Copenhagen, his voice began to change, and his skilled soprano was lost forever. He was then taken in, perhaps out of pity or admiration or both, by the director of the Royal Danish Theatre, Jonas Collin, who would go on to oversee the means for his formal education. It was through this that Hans Christian Andersen first met Jonas's son, Edvard Collin. The two eventually became close friends, and Andersen grew to be more than a little bit in love with Edvard. Okay, so the subject of Andersen's sexuality has been a hot debate amongst his biographers through the years. There are those who quite literally try to explain the gay away, saying that he couldn't have been gay given he had romantically pursued women throughout his life. This is, in fact, true. He had sought out women, like Reborg Voigt, with whom he wrote love letters long after her marriage to another man. He also pursued Swedish soprano Jenny Lind, who, by the way, is the same Jenny Lind as seen in the musical Barnum, maybe more recently remembered as the character that is more or less presented in The Greatest Showman starring Hugh Jackman. And what did Jenny Lind say to Hans Christian Andersen's affections? However, Andersen, who was an avid diarist, made several mentions of his infatuations with men as well. Allegedly, he had intended that his diaries be destroyed after his death, an intention that seems to have been largely overlooked. While he had romantically pursued men like Danish ballet dancer Harold Schaff, many biographers have cited Edvard Collin as the great love of Andersen's life, though this was complicated by those feelings not being reciprocated. This, to me, is more crucial to consider than exhaustingly trying to label Andersen as gay, bisexual, or queer, words and affiliations deriving from a lexicon and world far beyond that of 19th century Europe. For in all of Andersen's romantic interests, those feelings were never returned. He and Edvard Collin would become lifelong friends, in spite of Andersen's subtle, sometimes not so subtle, attentions toward Edvard as young men, such as he expressed in letters where he would write things like, "I long for you. My sentiments are those of a woman. The femininity of my nature and our friendship must remain a mystery." Edvard Collin would write in his memoir many years later, "I found myself unable to respond to his love, and this caused the author much suffering." By 1836, Collin would be married, leaving Andersen heartbroken and feeling betrayed. The Little Mermaid, which was published within a year of these events, can and has been viewed as a love letter to Edvard Collin, a consolation for Andersen's unrequited love. The original story is similar to the Disney version, with some major caveats along the way. Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, nameless, as are the rest of the characters, rescues a young human prince from a shipwreck. It's love at first sight, and before he can wake on shore, she is driven back to the sea at the approach of postulants from the nearby convent. Consumed by her love for the prince, the Little Mermaid turns to the sea witch to become human. The witch agrees, giving her a potion that will give her legs. But there is a price for this. The Little Mermaid must give up her life at sea, furtherly giving up her voice. The Andersen version actually has the sea witch cut out the Little Mermaid's tongue, a detail that is often left out of subsequent versions. Once on land, human and living in the palace, the prince does grow fond of the Little Mermaid, in spite of her quietness. But rather than everything working out in the end of this fairy tale, The prince ends up marrying a princess from the neighboring kingdom. The sea witch presents the Little Mermaid with a further bargain. Should she kill the prince, she will be able to turn back into a mermaid and return home. But overcome by her love for the prince, the Little Mermaid instead decides to sacrifice herself. Andersen here tries to reconcile this tragedy with the possibility of a hopeful ending, if not exactly a happy one. In his original telling of the story, gaining a soul is a huge part of the Little Mermaid's desire to be human. It is explained that merpeople do not have immortal souls, and when they reach the end of their lives, about 300 years according to Hans Christian Andersen, they dissolve into sea foam, never to live again. As described by Andersen, human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, living on after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see. By gaining the love of the prince, the Little Mermaid has a chance to gain a soul that can only come from him. This, of course, doesn't pan out the way she hopes. Dejected and resolved to her fate, she hurls herself into the sea, where she will surely turn to sea foam. But through all her suffering and sacrifice, she instead becomes a daughter of the air. Stay with me here. The daughters of the air are basically invisible spirits which look after mankind, I guess. And after 300 years of good deeds, they will earn an immortal soul, where they can then take part in the happiness of mankind. Andersen ends this fairy tale by speaking directly to the children, saying, "Unseen, we, the daughters of the air, can enter the houses of men where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child, who is the joy of his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened. The child does not know, when we fly through the room, that we smile with joy at his good conduct. For we can count 1 year less of our 300 years. But when we see a naughty or wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow, and for every tear, a day is added to our time of trial." The original ending of The Little Mermaid, while perfectly suitable to the time it was published in, is rather baffling to contemporary readers. P.L. Travers, the author of the Mary Poppins books, reflected on The Little Mermaid very critically, calling the story demoralizing, descending into Victorian morality written to scare children into good behavior. In my conversation with Hadley Abrams about the ending, they offered a rather complicated view of what Andersen may have intended and how we interpret that today.
I had read the original as like a very, very little kid. It somehow wound up in our like grade 3 classroom. And in retrospect, it's like, oh, that, like, this is, we wouldn't give this to kids now. Like this OG version, really. I think maybe at the time, like the intent was no matter what lengths you go to try and change yourself for other people, that doesn't work. Or sometimes just like the world is stacked against you and they won't accept you regardless, which is very sad. And I guess in a way, changing for other people doesn't work. And it's kind of tricky given the tragedy of the whole thing and the sort of the way that she does only change for other people, but the fact that it's something that she wants regardless of all that, like taking all the pain, losing her family, losing everything she loves and eventually like herself. Anytime I read or see something where someone loses their voice, it's a really important, like, metaphorical, like, symbol of, like, a loss of agency and a loss of, like, self-expression. So it's tricky because it's sort of, they're sort of two sides of it. That in one way it's her trying to take agency and follow the thing that she's always wanted, but also having to sacrifice so much for that and then ending awfully. Like, I guess, like, sort of very niche, coming at it from, like, a trans metaphor. The fact that it ends with her killing herself, the fact that, like, it causes her constant pain, but she does it because she knows that the world that she wants to be in is not the one she was born into. And the fact that like that involves a bodily transformation, it's sort of hard for me not to read it that way, even though that for sure was not the original like intention.
The best way that I can summarize all of this is that the original telling of The Little Mermaid is basically a product of the conservative and highly moralistic period of 19th century Europe. And while there are biographers that say that Hans Christian Andersen did not imbue his stories with religion, I think it's naive to say there is no spiritual connotation here. After all, it is not the secular Little Mermaid that wins the prince's heart. It is the princess from the neighboring kingdom, who, just before meeting the prince, was serving as a postulant at a seaside convent where he took refuge. At the same time, Hans Christian Andersen doesn't necessarily project his own Protestant faith, nor any other religion in his stories. Not directly, anyway. At least through the eyes of this recovering Catholic speaking to you now. Hi, hello. Andersen inserts elements of Christian ideology, like the immortal soul and rebirth and resurrection, to shape his fairy tales. Rather than just propagating religion or faith itself, the purpose of these elements really have more to do with Andersen's desire for consolation, to be remembered, even after death. If you ever get a chance to read some of his letters and diary entries, you get a sense of a restless, some might say neurotic man, never feeling settled in the world, let alone in his own skin. By many accounts, he was not an easy person to get along with. The sense of isolation, despair, and otherness he felt finds itself in The Little Mermaid, along with other works of his like The Ugly Duckling, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, and The Little Match Girl. But these temporal feelings are usually resolved by the end of his stories, in the case of the latter two, by death. These recurring themes in his work offer a romantic, if somewhat broken worldview, where life offers little in respite or solace for those that despair. Despite his rise as a literary figure in Europe, and gaining access to high society and Danish royalty, Hans Christian Andersen would always feel separate, other throughout his life, and while some may find comfort that his stories did live beyond him, the actual memory of his life is never quite resolved and may never be. Whatever Andersen intended with his telling of The Little Mermaid, its story has been made pliable to fit the intentions of that particular adaptation. In some versions, she lives, some she dies, and the message or moral of the story seems to morph every time. On the 1961 episode of Shirley Temple's storybook that featured The Little Mermaid, she doesn't win the affections of the prince, though she is granted the chance, by the god of Neptune, of all people, to return to the sea as a mermaid. The moral of this telling that bringing happiness to those we love can be the most important way of loving them. A 1975 Japanese anime version of the story stays closer to Andersen's tragic ending, where, at least in the English dub, the mermaid's soul ascends to heaven, where she will guide the wayward hearts of men so she shall live forever. And then there is the 1987 episode of Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater, where the spirit of the Little Mermaid befriends and protects all those true lovers whose love is as deep as the ocean and as true as her own unselfish heart. This version, by the way, features of all people Helen Mirren as the princess of the neighboring kingdom, and a very brief appearance by Broadway's Donna McKechnie, seen here being blasted by a Beyoncé wind fan, which honestly is one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my life. Seriously, check it out. Around the time that this particular adaptation aired, Walt Disney Pictures was developing their own version of this story, having originally shelved a treatment back in the 1940s. Like I said at the beginning of this video, things were tense at the studio. Power executives like Michael Eisner, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg had come to Disney as outsiders from Paramount and Warner Brothers. The culture clash between these executives and the animators culminated into the whole department being moved off the lot, where all artists assumed their days working for Disney were numbered. After a recommendation from David Geffen, Jeffrey Katzenberg invited Alan Menken and Howard Ashman to work on songs for The Little Mermaid. The two had found success with the original off-Broadway run of Little Shop of Horrors, of which Geffen had been co-producer. And while Howard Ashman's recent Broadway venture with the musical Smile had been a personal, embarrassing failure,
It did at the very least put him in proximity to actress Jodie Benson, who he would ultimately fly out to Los Angeles to record the voice of Ariel in The Little Mermaid. Side note here, as demonstrated in this very famous clip, Howard Ashman was incredibly specific with what he wanted in tone and intention while recording the film, sometimes suggesting lines and even line readings, which for some actors can be a sensitive issue. But in subsequent interviews, both Jodie Benson and Pat Carroll, who would voice Ursula the Sea Witch, expressed nothing but gratitude for Ashman's guidance. In fact, Howard Ashman became something of a Pied Piper during the film's production. Working through a time where morale at the studio was perhaps a bit shaky, the studio found a visionary who correlated Disney's long musical tradition with the modules of the musical theater. Concepts like the I Want song may have initially baffled some of the seasoned animators at the studio, but through Howard Ashman, who would end up being one of the film's executive producers, they willingly followed through on his vision, right down to the art conception. For instance, Ursula had initially been modeled after actress Joan Collins, but Ashman worked with artist Rob Minkoff to further develop the character design, eventually using Baltimore drag queen Divine as a model for the character.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Kill everyone now. Condone first-degree murder. Advocate cannibalism. Eat
So the next time someone says Disney has always been wholesome and squeaky clean, remind them that The Little Mermaid's villain bears the likeness of a drag queen that ate dog feces and pink flamingos. Like other treatments, the film's writers and directors, John Musker and Ron Clements, use Hans Christian Andersen's story as a springboard to take the film where they needed to go, creating new characters and subplots, giving their Little Mermaid the happy ending she deserves. This Little Mermaid, the character of Ariel, has a lot more agency than her original rendering. She's spunky, rebellious, independent. In this version, the human world is something to fear and avoid, but not to her. Long before she sets eyes on the handsome prince, it's a world that fascinates her, a world full of wonder and beauty, and she wants nothing more than to be a part of that world. And as hard as it may be to believe, this particular scene was very nearly cut by Jeffrey Katzenberg after a mixed reaction from a preview audience. Fortunately, after petitioning from many, including Glenn Keane, who animated the scene, it was put back in, which, how can you possibly imagine this movie without that scene? The Little Mermaid was met by near universal acclaim, enthusiastic box office numbers, and eventually Oscars for the film's score and Under the Sea for Best Song. Many critics called the film a return to form for the studio, recalling the esteem of early Disney classics. It's interesting to imagine certain members of the studio and their reaction to the success, having internally expressed nervousness about this female-centric movie isolating members of their audience, specifically young boys who may have thought this movie was a girls' movie. You can read these concerns in some of the movie's original TV spots.
From Walt Disney Pictures, he's the king of the sea. She's his evil enemy. And they're in a fight to the finish. So be it. And everything in his power to win the battle.
You're just going to have to trust me when I say that this movie transcended gender lines, and many young boys loved this movie growing up. Watching it today as an adult, I still personally have great fondness for this movie, appreciating it for what it is with just the right touch of nostalgia.
Daddy'll love that.
Also, watching this and other Disney movies as a gay adult man, it is fascinating to clock some of the subtle but undeniable queer coding in some of these characters that once you see, you can't unsee.
You're so weird.
You have no idea.
The fact that this queer coding is often bestowed upon the Disney villains of this period can potentially lead some to a problematic analysis. But beginning with Ursula in The Little Mermaid, knowing that the divine character model was conceived in part by Howard Ashman, himself a gay man, I think this queer coding is perhaps less about the archness of the character and more about tapping into their inherent otherness for a far more compelling take.
I think it's so valid as like queer people to sort of like, I see gay and I will say gay. If that is not like explicitly in the text, it's like it's a vibe. It's the gaydar. It was so wild to me that was not a thing that I thought was like, everyone picks up on this, surely. And it's not necessarily about, you know, the gay agenda, making everyone gay. It's like, no, we just want to also be represented in the stories that we love. And a lot of the time we love the stories that we do because there is this underlying narrative or metaphor or sort of some symbols that just inherently speak to people that have had to like hide for a long time.
The nostalgia I mentioned earlier would prove to be a profitable well that Disney could draw from in the following years. Beginning in the 2010s, for instance, the studio began producing live-action reimaginings of classic animated titles like Cinderella and The Jungle Book, finally with a full gangbusters musical version of Beauty and the Beast in 2017, which would go on to gross over $1.2 billion at the box office. Shortly before the 2019 release of The Lion King, which would also gross well over $1 billion at the box office, Disney announced plans to go ahead with a live-action remake of The Little Mermaid starring Halle Bailey as Ariel. Speaking for myself, I wasn't familiar with Halle from TV shows like Grownish or being one part of the musical duo of Chloe and Halle with sister Chloe Bailey. But one needs only YouTube one of her performances to know that she is a talented singer who can more than handle the Ashman and Menken songs. There was, and is, of course, the subsequent backlash surrounding her casting, which... Look, I'm assuming if you've made it this far, I'm more or less preaching to the choir here. And if you've made it this far and are still waiting for me to cry woke or flash "not my Ariel" across the screen, this is your chance to dislike this video, unsubscribe, pop in the DVD of the original movie, and live your best life. Without, you know, the racist part, I can maybe entertain some frustration from people who loved the original movie, like I did, wondering why it has to be changed and reinvented, and unfortunately, that is the slippery slope a company like Disney makes when profiting from nostalgia. So much of what attracts audiences to these remakes is the curiosity and excitement about how certain moments from the animated movie will translate to real life. I mean, real life. My sympathies rest, to a point, with the filmmakers, who must constantly ride the line between ingenuity and giving the audience exactly what they want. Think back to 2007, when Disney Theatricals produced the Broadway version of The Little Mermaid. I don't think most people could have anticipated director Francesca Zambello's bold and avant-garde take on the piece, which involved two key stagecraft rules: no flying cables and no water effects. The ultimate result was met with wildly mixed reactions from audiences and critics alike. A physical production that Thomas Schumacher, the president of Disney Theatricals, referred to later as a swing and a miss. With all respects to the talents involved, and I might be going on a whim here, I don't think most people came to The Little Mermaid expecting to see performers on roller skates. I also wonder if people actually anticipated seeing a 6-foot man dressed as a crab. No doubt it's theatrical, but unlike, say, director Julie Taymor's take on The Lion King just 10 years before, Francesca Zambello's unconventional approach to The Little Mermaid was not embraced by the public. Perhaps most audiences were hoping to see what they already knew on the stage. Since closing on Broadway, the musical has received several revisions through the years, and has become a popular show to stage regionally. In regards to the Disney live-action remakes, I'm generally pretty neutral or passive about them. They seem at once trying to expand on the original films while simultaneously overblowing them with inconsequential material. And even when recreating iconic moments that we all know, it always reads rather self-conscious to me, visually excessive and somewhat garish to the freshness of the original film. It's interesting to note that Howard Ashman, even before the release of the original Little Mermaid, intuitively understood the inherent fallibility in live-action movie musicals.
I don't know why people think that film musicals work. I think they did during the Depression and maybe during part of the 40s and early 50s. But I think it's very hard, just the nature of the medium. And when people start to sing, it's pretty silly in the theater, and it's even sillier when you're taking a picture of it.
To add a parenthesis, I feel very fortunate that we've, I think, found ourselves in the one area in films where musicals might work, and that is in animation over at Disney.
Yeah, it seems like there might be a little corner of the world there in animation where Broadway skills apply.
Frankly, whatever I or any reviewer has to say about these Disney remakes really doesn't matter, because these films reliably make a lot of money on their own merit, and beyond any artistic endeavor, that really is the bottom line. I know people like, yes, me, will come to this movie with countless perspectives and histories with The Little Mermaid, some without knowing the original story or ever having seen the original Disney movie. What is sadly inevitable are those who will come to this movie, or the comments of this video, hi, hello, with the sole purpose of riling up anger about a black actress playing this character. The faux outrage on this subject has often cited some sort of erasure, claiming that this new version is taking something away from those that love the original Little Mermaid, when the reality is the original version is not going anywhere. The same way that the animated versions of Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King are still beloved. If the actual issue is a black actress playing a character that one has an affinity for, well, sadly, this video can't help with that. Ironically, on the subject of erasure, up until recently, Disney Plus was about to remove the documentary Howard, an exploration of the life and career of Howard Ashman, from its streaming catalog. And only after significant protests online did the company reverse this decision. It did not go unnoticed that on the eve of the premiere of this new remake, a documentary about the gay man that helped rebuild the Disney brand, who was instrumental in the success of the original Little Mermaid, was about to be quietly removed from the company's streaming service. Howard Ashman died in March of 1991 due to complications with HIV, and I have often wondered what he might have gone on to do had he not passed away. The truth is that the threat of any kind of erasure of queer people does feel personal, and in the age of Don't Say Gay and discriminatory legislations passing around the world, it seems more important than ever to hold on to those histories.
Like, I find it so sad, especially because it's like two steps forward, like one step forward, two steps back, because I think like in some areas it is getting so much better, even in like very recently, but then also the willful ignorance, or the willful not even entertaining the idea of being educated, because I think for, you know, the hardcore like transphobes and homophobes, it's like they don't want to learn, they don't want to entertain the idea that like we're all just people and that we are the same. I just know that it makes me feel so like happy and so seen and safe when things are allowed to be explicit and canonical, and we don't have to read between the lines anymore. I know that there is just a group of people that are unwilling to listen, and you know, you can have compassion for them, but then at a certain point, like, that compassion is exhausting when they refuse to have it for you.
Knowing of Hans Christian Andersen's conception of the original story, The Little Mermaid will always inherently be a queer allegory. With the changing zeitgeist, however, our read of it has changed, and it seems inevitable that we seek another telling of it. The 1989 Little Mermaid wasn't the first to do so, and I suspect this latest version won't be the last, because at its core, this is a transcendent and universal story about the outsider, of yearning for a world that seems beyond our own. While Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid might have succumbed to a lack of fortune, time has allowed his heroine's fate to be revised, for the possibility of not just a hopeful, but a happy ending as well. I think we all want to see ourselves in that story, and with all of my little gay heart, I don't see how a world like that could be bad.